talking about India's progress, prowess, and day on day, one rating agency on the other says India is likely to be the third largest economy. In fact, S&P now reinstating, reaffirming that if India continues to grow at 7% and above, third largest economy by 2030.
I know. I think 2030 is still, I think, a long distance away, Shweta, and I believe that the 5 trillion mark, given that we are at about 3.75 trillion already, we will arrive at that 5 trillion magic hype number of 5 trillion. I don't know if it is a big enough number to celebrate, but we would be the third largest economy exceeding the 5 trillion mark much sooner than 2030. And multiple other rating agencies, multiple other reports have reaffirmed that even if you continue to grow at about 7%, 7.2%, then in the next 3 years, FY28 or so is when we would reach that $5 trillion mark. But again, I think the fundamental question there is 5 trillion good enough? Given that we are the fastest growing major economy and the most populous country in the world, and the fact that our unemployment rate continues to hover around the double-digit mark, excess of 9% for the last 3 months, then this jobless growth is what I think India should get up and worry about, as opposed to being the third largest. I mean, it's okay to be number 3 in a class where the number 1 and number 2 in any case are miles ahead of you, and number 4 and number 5 are degrowing. So Japan and Germany have not been able to keep pace because of their aging population and because of manufacturing, which was their calling card, moving away to China. The fact that you have laggards and you have economies which are floundering, unable to find their feet, I think the celebration of being the third largest on the back of other economies not doing as well should not really be a case of celebration. But having said that, of course, I think we will have to take it 1 year at a time, every quarter, in one instance. And if you're able to keep up with this growth momentum, and what S&P has also mentioned, which I agree with, that India has to prove its own manufacturing prowess and establish itself as a great alternative to China in becoming the manufacturing hub of the world. And only if that manufacturing starts happening in India at scale, and not just to feed the domestic demand, but also cater to international demand, that is when I think we would make some headway when it comes to real growth.
All right. So I have 2 questions for you. First, to begin with, I mean, not just S&P, CLSA also says that India is going to be the largest economy by 2047.
2052.
To 52 to 47. So a couple of decades from now at $45 trillion. Do these numbers mean anything to the common person who's listening to this bulletin right now? When we talk about joblessness, that's on a high at 9% and above for the last 3 months, as you rightly pointed out. A number of other factors that are not really working for people. Inflation, I mean, it's still under RBI's, RBI's tolerance limit, intolerance band, but still very high for a lot of people who would be buying, let's say, vegetable on a daily basis. What do these numbers really mean for the common man?
Sure.
What is the challenge that they are looking at, and are those challenges being catered to by the government?
Let's look at one factor at a time. If you talk about inflation, I think inflation is always cyclical, and if it doesn't happen in cycles during a year, it does happen in cycles over a period of time. So in a span of 10 years, you would on an average have at least 4 cycles of high inflation, and that is what India and the rest of the world is battling right now. So what do you do when you're faced with high inflation? Obviously, there are some fiscal measures which are not very accurate in taming inflation. Monetary measures like tightening and increasing rates is what the RBI and other central banks in the world have done. So that is an immediate knee-jerk reaction to tame inflation and not let the inflation pinch the common man. So inflation is going to be cyclical, and economies around the world, including India, cannot shy away from inflation hitting them and tackling inflation using whatever matrices and whatever measures required to tame inflation. Now, on the other hand, you're right. I think we've got to not look at the GDP number as a whole, but look at GDP divided by the population, per capita GDP. Given that you are at $3.7 trillion, housing the world's largest number of people, you have a very small per capita GDP. Compare that with Japan and compare that with Germany, which are right now number 3 and number 4 in the pecking order. While their absolute number, given the size of the country and given the size of the population, if the number is still, in the realm of about $4.4, $4.5 trillion, divide that by the population, they have a much higher per capita GDP. So I think India has to look at itself on the basis of per capita GDP, and that is where China has done much better than India. Up until April this year, China was the world's most populous country and has continued to be the second largest economy in size. So you are at a value of about $18 trillion or so of economy size, and that makes sense on a per capita level as well. So at 5 trillion, India is not going to cut it on the per capita GDP.
And even per capita GDP, as many analysts would say right now, is a function of averages. And it doesn't really matter in a country where 99% of the wealth is controlled by 1% of the people. So it does not really mean that each of these people are getting equal money. It essentially means you're coming at averages.
But Shweta, then that sort of, brings you back to this capitalism versus socialism debate. So do you want to continue being a hardcore capitalist country where you allow businesses to flourish and you allow businesses to profit and contribute back to both job creation, capital investment, as well as adding taxes back to the economy, etc. So that is the capitalist way of looking at it. And in that scenario, there is going to be some disparity. How wide that disparity, again, I think depends on what are the policies in place to either try to tame it or let free markets flourish. Now, if you were to take a socialist stand, then providing that enabling environment to companies to flourish, to reduce or to add to equitable growth or reduce this disparity is not going to be fair to corporate India as well. But then, of course, I think employment is something that you have to tackle, as the first priority. In addition to that, per capita income, which again is a function of how much revenue the government is generating versus the cost that the government is incurring on account of either infrastructure development or any other, social scheme that the government wants to outlay. So you've got to look at employment, you've got to look at per capita income, and you've got to look at per capita GDP. I think if you're able to make headway on these three parameters, then a 5 trillion or a 7 trillion or a 35 trillion or a 45 trillion by 2052 will make sense. But I think these headlines are going to come every day, and while it's good to celebrate that $5 trillion mark, and there were some fake headlines also sometime back that India has already reached the $4 trillion mark, etc., which hopefully we should reach by end of this financial year, and that data should come out maybe in the month of June or July next year. But I think celebration of a benchmark of a headline 5 trillion is great. Ideally, India should have been at 5 trillion in 2022. But then you had a black swan event like COVID in between, right?
Yes.
So I think 5 trillion is a good number, a wow number. It takes you up in the report card, in the ranking of countries around the world. But then at 5 trillion, you don't cut it on other parameters like per capita income, per capita GDP. And of course, if all this growth is happening on account of almost double-digit unemployment, then it's a serious challenge.
Absolutely. So perhaps a longer sort of period needed for a sustained growth, and that would bring us on the chart of a country that's doing not just well in a parameter division, but also when it comes to per capita income and per capita GDP.